Good morning, and welcome to the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy's live weekly broadcast. I'm Roberta Oster, the Communications Director. Our program focuses on economic, racial, social, and environmental justice policy, and we are grateful for the expertise and perspective of faith leaders, policy experts, legislators, and community leaders. Our program shares opportunities for you to get involved in our work advancing social justice and helping our neighbors. And we will keep you up to date and keep our elected officials accountable. This broadcast is interactive. We really care what you think, and we would love for you to ask questions during the show. Please write in your questions on our Facebook feed. Today, we're going to be addressing a critical issue, the crisis of evictions in Virginia. And I am pleased to introduce our guests. Reverend Donte McCutchen of the Love Cathedral Community Church in Richmond, Phil Storey, who is an attorney with the Virginia Poverty Law Center, and Elaine Poon, who is an attorney with the Legal Aid Justice Center. Thank you all for being with us today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, my colleague and friend, Jase Hatcher, who is the Welcoming All Program Coordinator for the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. Jase?
Thank you so much, Roberta, and thank you all for being here with us today. So I'd really like to start by talking about where we're at right now. Why is there a looming eviction crisis? I think a lot of people were under the impression that there was an eviction moratorium. So what happened?
This is Elaine, and thank you all so much for the work you do and for having us talk about this important issue. I just thought I would go over a bit of the timeline of how we got here. Our executive director, Angela Cholfi, summed it up perfectly the other day when she said, there has been kind of a little game of not it for those of you who have kids when it comes to Virginians losing their homes during the pandemic. It's kind of been a back and forth with the governor and the Supreme Court. So back when the pandemic kind of really hit around mid-March, the governor issued a state of emergency. And the Supreme Court followed suit and issued a similar order that closed down all the courts to non-emergency hearings. And with some advocacy from the legal aid community, the Supreme Court also included evictions in the closure of the court. That means that people could not come and landlords could not hear evictions in the courtrooms. However, some of you may remember the governor started to signal that he was going to reopen the state in some of his press conferences, and almost immediately afterwards, the Supreme Court lifted essentially that moratorium or that court closure and allowed evictions to be heard in courts across Virginia starting May 18th. Those few weeks, I've done legal aid work for a long time. Were probably one of the most frightening weeks that we've seen as legal aid attorneys. Attorneys were in court with their tenants, clients, were risking their lives basically to attend court. We witnessed dozens of tenants receive eviction judgments. Some of them were default judgments because they didn't show up, and we don't know why they didn't show up. Were they scared of receiving, contracting COVID? Did they not receive notice about court? So across the state, including this group, Virginia Interfaith Center, with the Coalition for Immigrant Rights, pushed the governor to do something about it. And we actually pushed for the same thing that we're pushing for now, which is to stop evictions through an executive order. And instead, he went back to the Supreme Court and asked them to hold off on hearings again. So then there was a back and forth again. We had a short-lived victory on June 8th until June 29th. We had another eviction moratorium. But then the Supreme Court let that lapse and refused to extend that moratorium. Yesterday marked the 1 month mark of evictions being heard in the courtrooms during a pandemic. And so based on our court records, over 2,300 households have now lost their homes just in this past month because of this reopening.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Elaine. That is harrowing. Phil, did you want to add to that?
Yeah. So one thing I think that there's been an eviction crisis in Virginia for years, and that was something that a couple of years ago in April 2018 really sort of literally hit the front page of the New York Times, and so it started getting more attention with policymakers and things like that. And we've done stuff as a result of that, but then this pandemic and the economic collapse have really supercharged the crisis that we already had. And so there has always been a desperate need to address the underlying factors that are making people so insecure in their housing, renters specifically. But it's just, it's sort of an order of magnitude greater now than it was before.
Thank you for highlighting that. Are there estimates on the number of Virginians at risk of losing their housing during the pandemic?
This number has been pretty difficult to come up with. So the US Census has actually put out a household pulse survey. That's kind of the closest thing that we found in terms of numbers, and they estimate 384,000 households. Right now the cases pending in court are almost 10,000 on the docket, but with the CARES Act expiring and landlords being allowed to initiate evictions starting this week, and then unemployment benefits decreasing very soon as well, I have a feeling that data is going to, those numbers might be larger. Also, there's a lot of data already coming out that talk about how communities of color are being hit so much harder than the rest of the nation, than the rest of Virginia. And so, that household pulse survey is showing clear disproportionate impacts for these households.
Yeah, and I think to put in perspective the numbers of, hundreds of thousands of Virginians in the next few months that are at risk of eviction, historically, so for the past decade, since the Great Recession, general district courts in Virginia have heard an average of about 13,000 eviction cases every month. So for the numbers we're looking at, if those numbers are correct, we're talking about many tens of thousands of eviction cases every month. Now, before, I think the courts would tell you that they were pretty much running at capacity. It's not like there were a lot of court clerks, sitting around doing nothing, and not a lot of courtrooms, that were just not utilized. And that was before we needed to worry about social distancing, about the sanitizing and things like that, and before people would be afraid to come to court specifically because either they're symptomatic or they're high risk or whatever. And so I think I have no idea how the courts are going to be able to manage. It's hard for me to imagine how the courts are going to be able to manage 70,000 cases in a month when the most they've done in the past is 18,000 cases in a really bad month. And what that means too is that people who desperately need the protections of the laws and both federal and state protections are going to have a really hard time getting those that are their rights, because they're going to be afraid to go to court, or they're going to go to court and they're going to end up in a waiting room that is overcrowded, and they're going to leave to protect their loved ones at home or whatever. Or the judges are going to have really heavy dockets, and they're going to need to figure out how to manage those in a way that's fair to people as well as safe. It's going to be. I have a hard time imagining what that's going to be like.
Reverend Donte, that's a weighty discussion we just had, but I just wanted to have the opportunity for you to weigh in on some of the discussions that you are hearing, whether in your congregation or in the communities that you serve, about how folks are feeling during the pandemic and the level of housing insecurity that people are facing right now?
Well, people are afraid, people are worried, people are nervous, furious. Basically because, as the brother has already said, this is not new. It's kind of already been here. This crisis has been here, this disparity. It was pre-virus, it was COVID-19. A lot of this was going on already. And so people are kind of worried about some things, and they're trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? How is our city going to help us? How is our state going to help us? Is there money? Is there more money? And what about the money that was already there? Did they use it properly? These are the discussions that are going on, and these are the concerns that are happening amongst us. And so that's basically what I'm hearing in as far as the discussions are concerned.
Thank you for that. Elaine, you gave an estimate. You did say that it is difficult to crunch the numbers, right, on who is potentially at risk and how many individuals. But I know that some of us have heard also of a rent relief program. To speak to what Reverend Donte was speaking of, I believe the number was $50 million. But with the numbers that you have given, I'm quickly doing some math in my head, and 50 million doesn't seem like enough.
It's not enough at all. I was just hearing Reverend Donte talk about the fear and where is the money question. I think a lot about how one of the first things we heard about when the pandemic hit was how all small businesses received all of this relief because people were so worried about the economy. And so I think it's fair, and I think it makes sense for a similar relief program to be available to regular Virginians. That $50 million is not enough. So the governor's own housing department actually requested $200 million in rent relief. Even that's not enough. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition has actually come up with the number $2.3 billion for the coming year, right? So that's a 12-month estimation. And the Commonwealth Institute fact-checked that number, and they felt secure about that number. And it's actually lower than what we need, which is very difficult to wrap our heads around. But $2.3 billion for the next 12 months is actually based on people who are already cost burdened. That means, just like Phil said, we were already in an eviction crisis before the pandemic hit. There were already $2.3 billion worth of need in this community in Virginia. And that just doesn't account for all the people who have lost their jobs, who have not been able to work because they got sick, because their kids are stuck at home, because they can't go to school. So I think that number is going to be a lot bigger, and which is why our group has been asking for $1 billion to the end of the year.
That $1 billion, and the estimate is $2.3 billion for 12 months. That's significantly more. I've heard a couple of comments now mentioned, Reverend Donte and also Phil. It seems like this crisis of evictions did not come out of nowhere. And even for all the unpredictability that COVID has posed, would any of you like to speak to some of the pre-existing conditions in Virginia that have contributed to where we are now with evictions?
So, I can tell you what I see. So one of the things, so I'm a housing attorney at the Virginia Poverty Law Center, and I also run the statewide Eviction Legal Helpline, which is a service for anyone in Virginia who's a renter who's facing potential eviction. They can get in touch with us. They can call 1-833-NO-EVICT, or they can go to evictionhelpline.org. And so we hear cases, we hear from people all around the state. And one of the things that really strikes me is there's just simply not enough affordable housing for low-income people. We saw recently in Richmond, there was a big proposed development in downtown called the Navy Hill development proposal, and the developers were proposing affordable housing, but it meant housing that's affordable for folks who are solidly middle class. there was nothing for the people who have low income. And so at the same time, we're seeing Richmond Redevelopment and Housing Authority and other public housing authorities around the state and around the country are really planning to reduce the stock of public housing and leave low-income folks with fewer and fewer options. That's a crisis. That's a long-term crisis. It's a tectonic shift that's been going on for a long time. And we're really gonna, that is one of the things that is fueling this. A couple of other quick things. Evictions fuel a downward spiral in housing options. So when somebody gets evicted and the court records reflect that, then the next place they go, they submit an application and the landlord uses a tenant screening company, kind of like a credit reporting company, to decide whether this person is somebody that they would want to rent to. So the more evictions you have, the less desirable options you're going to have, and you end up with more exploitative landlords in worse physical conditions, sometimes in more dangerous neighborhoods, and it just is a downward spiral that this is why Matthew Desmond's book Eviction, Evicted, was so eye-opening. Is he was saying evictions are a cause of poverty, not just a result of poverty. And then finally, as has been mentioned, as Elaine mentioned, the RVA eviction lab findings from here at VCU show that even controlling for other factors, the biggest factor for whether or not a family is likely to face eviction is their race. If they're African American, they are more likely, even controlling for all the other things. We need to figure out why that is and remedy that, because we just cannot let that stand.
Yeah, I wanted to open the floor to Reverend Donte as well. You were nodding your head a little bit when Phil was saying some of that. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, when we talk about poverty, I'm looking at the fact that we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and we're talking about evictions. We're talking about evictions, which may lead to homelessness and struggle with different things when it comes to eviction. Where do I sleep? Where do I eat? Can I go to work? Am I able to be?
I apologize. I think we have a little bit of a freeze on Reverend Donte. Reverend Donte, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Did I go out or something? I apologize. So, the shelters will begin to flood. And the shelters flood, then the social distancing, it goes out the window. So now we have more poverty, we have more disease, and we understand that Black Americans, we've been suffering from discrimination around public policies, including housing. So this is a big deal for me, and it's a big deal for the community. And as a pastor, as a person of faith, I just believe that we have to fight, and we have to speak up, and we have to say something about this. And he said, well, why is this happening? We know why it's happening. It's because of the color of our skin. We are looked at, the value of being Black and brown is just so low. And so that's what's happening here. And I don't want to really get into scriptures and things of that nature, because I'll start preaching. So I'm going to just be quiet right now. But I will say that he who opposes the poor shows contempt for their maker. But whoever is kind to the needy honors God. And I think this is a time where our state, our country, we need to honor God, and we need to make provisions for the poor. We need to make provisions for the needy. So I'm gonna be quiet now.
Please don't be quiet. We so appreciate that, right? I think you've highlighted something really important, both Phil and Reverend Donte. Even when we're looking at COVID data currently, when it's broken down by race and ethnicity, there is an incredible racial disparity in Virginia right now. And to Reverend Dante's point, I feel that those same systemic factors are at play in the disproportionate infections of COVID, and in particular communities, the Black, Latinx, and communities we don't even have data for at the moment in Virginia. So thank you so much for highlighting that. I wanted to go to a question from one of our viewers, Alan Chipman. He has said here, how will evictions in the midst of a pandemic that is managed by shelter in place exacerbate the rise in new COVID cases as people are losing their shelter, as we still have new cases on the rise? And how is this not being treated as a public health crisis as well as a moral crisis? Reverend Donte, do you want to speak to that first?
I don't want to speak to it first. It is a public health issue. It is a public health crisis. It is a moral crisis, and we need to speak up more about it. And so, you said how would eviction in this pandemic be managed by shelter in place? To be honest with you, I really don't know what to say. I really don't know what to say to that. I just think that, I said something on the day before yesterday that I'll say again, and I don't know if this is the correct English for it, but we need that money. We need the money. We need the money, and we need the money to be properly used. When I think about, health disparities, and I think about, this pandemic that we're in, when COVID-19 first came about, and Tent City was, they were evicted. And then they had nowhere to go. And we gave money to organizations to house them, and people were positive for COVID-19, and they were placed in places together without the knowledge of them even being positive. And it was like they all put them in a community for everybody to get infected or whatever. So, mismanagement of funds, misappropriation of funds, all of that is an issue for me right now. And so I'm concerned about how we are using the funds. I'm concerned about who is using the funds. And I don't know. I'm going to just be quiet here. We need the money. We need the proper people using the money. So when we talk about legislation and policy, I also talk about people who sit at the table and people who make the decisions. I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about that because our community is already suffering, and we will suffer more. And then here comes more, crime. Here comes more, hunger and things of that nature. So I don't know. I may have spoken all over the place, so I'm not even sure if I answer the question or not, but that is my heart.
And I'm not a public health expert. I would love to hear from public health experts on what this is really going to look like. And so one of the things that I think is that makes me wonder is, we hear things that I'm sure, communities of color have known about for a long time, but we hear some data actually showing that, yes, the healthcare system discounts the pain of Black women and people of color, that they are treated for pain less than white people. And so I just wonder if these same institutionalized biases that make these folks suffer because they're not considered as valuable or as worthy or trustworthy. I wonder if those same assumptions are baked into this other context. It would not be a big surprise that if the problem is really affecting people of color much more than white people, that it just doesn't get seen as important or as urgent.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that there are people who want to hear a lot of this conversation, but are struggling with some of the finer points of, maybe their family member is a landlord, maybe themselves, they are a small landlord. So we have a question here from Kim Bobo. What about small landlords who are struggling to pay their mortgages? In the sort of technical landscape of this, what does it look like for them?
Well, so there's a lot of relief available for them too. I think that landlords and property owners, obviously they have a seat at the table that they have always had. I mean, there's a reason why our tax code subsidizes home ownership. And so there's a lot of relief that's available to them. The legal system, the laws are set up to protect them as well in ways that the laws don't protect, say, other small business owners who maybe run a little store or a little shop or something like that. The law streamlines evictions in a way that it doesn't streamline other types of business disputes. And so we agree. I mean, there needs to be relief. It needs to be for folks who are having a hard time with their mortgage as well as renters. But it can't just be left to renters to sort of scramble while the homeowners who are getting their piece of the pie are getting their relief.
Right. And if I may, I believe, of course, everybody needs to come to the table. The owner, the renter, the homeless advocates, they all need to come to the table. We figure out how we deal with this, be strategic, involve and engage everyone. But we will not forget that, discrimination is serious. So for the landlord that cries out, struggle, I'm not saying that there is no struggle, but I am also saying that we have to be very careful, crying victim when we really are the stronger one. And we understand that, that the strong have a tendency to exploit the weak. And so we don't want to tiptoe around that either. We don't want to tiptoe around that. And so the landlords we love and we appreciate them, but we also have to be fair. If there's relief, take the relief. Don't cry victim just because of greed.
Thank you so much for that. Speaking of what can be done, right? I think that the picture that you all have so eloquently painted for us is that now is really a critical point in protecting so many Virginians. And so we are here today and people are watching. On all of your opinions, what can be done by either the administration or by legislators in Virginia to prevent mass evictions from occurring?
I can start. So we're called the legal aid community, and in fact, the Virginia Interfaith Center through VICPP, we are still asking the governor to issue an executive order to stop evictions. The buck stops with him. I think that the Attorney General's office has issued a written opinion that states that he has the authority to do that, and people can reach out to the governor. Actually, our website has a place where you can email the governor to encourage him to issue an executive order. We're not asking for an indefinite order. We're asking for a bridge between now and until the General Assembly can act. Someone asked about federal versus state. The federal moratorium, first of all, it expired this past weekend, and also it only covered 1/4 of the covered property, so meaning the landlords in Virginia. And also when it comes to Congress passing something compared to the governor being able to prevent all of the kind of horrors that Reverend Donte just described, that can happen immediately with one pen stroke. And that's what we're asking for. And we're also asking people to reach out to their legislators, their local legislators, to act in the special session in August, and then even ask the legislators to push the governor to bridge that gap. We can prevent a lot more spending actually in the long term, when it comes to homeless services and the public health crisis that might spike because of increased homelessness, by handling the situation in a preventative manner.
So, the project that I run is the Eviction Legal Helpline. That's a statewide resource that anyone can call if they're facing potential eviction. They're a renter, they're facing potential eviction. there's a couple of things. First of all, we need volunteers. So every year, like on a good year in Virginia, there are over 150,000 eviction cases filed. The Army of Legal Aid lawyers can only help about, on an average year, like 6,000 people with landlord-tenant disputes. Only 1,000 of those can they actually provide in-court representation. So there's an enormous need. The Eviction Legal Helpline is set up so that volunteers can help with doing the intake. Volunteers, attorneys can do the frontline legal advice for people, and then we give additional services as needed. But you can go to Eviction Legal Helpline there to sign up learn about volunteering, sign up as a volunteer. If you are a tenant and you've been to court recently on an eviction case, we have a little survey. We want to hear what's going on throughout the state in the courts, because some of these, there's new laws that were passed, federal and state law, that says that give tenants rights, and we're not seeing even administration or those rights are not being evenly applied or evenly considered in the different courts. We need to know what's going on so that we can raise the alarm if something needs to be improved.
And I just want to add, Phil is carrying a very heavy weight for the state of Virginia in doing this helpline. There is no right to counsel when it comes to landlord-tenant court, and so trying to have attorneys volunteer to the extent that they're willing. Please do reach out to Phil, and so we can actually try to carry this really heavy load.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Reverend Donte, I wanted to give, some space also for you and for the faith voice or the faith community to talk about, what can we do? How can we support what is happening in communities around Virginia?
Yeah, this is awesome. So this gives me a chance to give my scripture that I've been meditating on for the last week and a half. Psalms 82, starting at 1, it said, God calls the judges into his courtroom. He puts all the judges in the dock. Enough. You've corrupted justice long enough. You've let the wicked get away with murder. You're here to defend the defenseless, to make sure that underdogs get a fair break. Your job is to stand up for the powerless and to prosecute all those who exploit them. I say what we can do to help this situation is to continue to educate, continue to actively navigate, to resources and systems and things of that nature, and also continue to advocate. Let's continue to, put the word out, get the word out, educate people on what to do, how to do, get them to the different agencies and things that can help them. Also, that we would keep people hearing the fact that we are to rule in a way to protect the vulnerable. We are to rule in a way to protect the vulnerable. And that is our cry forever. We cry it in the streets. We cry it in the churches. We cry it in the homes. We cry it in our communities. As my job as a community leader is to just keep making noise, to just keep, encouraging people, to fight for what is right, to fight for what they want, and to, as the Bible says, to cry loud. And you can still be my friend, but I will call you out if you're wrong. So that's just that. Amen.
Amen, Reverend Donte. As someone who is not a person of faith, I was moved by that. So thank you very, very much. We wanted to answer one more question here from Alan Chipman. On the federal level, we have a president who was investigated by the DOJ for discriminating against tenants of color while he was a landlord. President Trump is now, in order to defend the suburban lifestyle dream, is proudly rolling back the Obama-era anti-discrimination rule for effectively furthering fair housing. How will this make it harder to diversify where low-income housing is placed as Ben Carson guts the Fair Housing Act?
So I guess I shouldn't have been too surprised. However, it was still very heartbreaking to see, especially some of those tweets that we saw. I think last night here in Charlottesville, and we're starting to work in Richmond as well, we've been looking at the, I guess, the tracing back of this eviction crisis back all the way to slavery times. When you talk about, this is not a new eviction crisis and disproportionate impacts, I think the better way to frame it is that this was by design. And there's a famous book called The Color of Law, and it talks about how all of the policies for the past several decades, centuries, have been policies of housing discrimination, but mainly of race discrimination. And the affirmatively furthering fair housing law was a law that acknowledged that deep entrenched racial discrimination in the housing law. Just to give you some examples, the first one would be, there were clear, very on the face, laws that said people who were of a certain race could not live in this neighborhood. They have to live in this other neighborhood. That other neighborhood, most of the time, basically being an industrial area, right? So people living next to factories were mostly African American, and the suburban areas were reserved for white people. There were clear laws on the books that said that. When that was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, there were other ways that people were able to get around that. People would create racial covenants. And now, all of those racial covenants, again, were illegal, but the vestiges of those discriminatory practices did not go away. And so when you look at the maps of what the city of Richmond looks like and what the city of Charlottesville looks like, you can overlay that old discriminatory ordinance right on top of what our suburbs and our segregation patterns look like today. It is by design. And what the affirmatively furthering fair housing law was trying to do was try to counteract that and say, we can create laws to try to encourage more affordable housing, or even just more integration into the different areas of cities that have this history, this dark history of segregation. And this was not just a huge legal, barrier to enforcing the Fair Housing Act. It's also just a signal to the whole country, that racial justice doesn't matter to this administration, and it's a real shame.
Absolutely. Reverend Donte, did you want to add to that?
I think it's going to be very hard to navigate, being that this is happening or trying to happen. We know that redlining and other policies segregated our communities, and I call out Navy Hill and the Navy Hill project. We understand that Navy Hill was a beautiful Black community, and look what happened. And then we want to come back, and want to do something. It's like, no. This is a plan, and it is a tool and a plan to do the same. I believe this eviction thing is a tool and a plan to do the same, to segregate our communities and to tear our families apart. That's just how I feel. So I do believe that it is going to be hard. It's going to be hard, but it's just them continuing the plan that they've already had.
Yeah, and Phil, I also want to give you a moment if you wanted to add to this weighty last portion of our discussion here. Please feel free.
No, I'm just inspired by the scripture that Pastor Donte quoted and other scripture. I'm a person of faith, and certainly over the past couple of years, I have been drawn to my faith tradition and to the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament. The prophets are pretty plain about the issues that we're facing today, and that we face. Sadly, over the past few years, it seems like we face new threats, or at least amplified threats, on a frequent basis. And I'm inspired by those teachings and those prophecies that directly address exactly what we're facing. So I'm grateful for the Interfaith Center, for Pastor Donte, and all the others who are connecting those dots. We need to.
I absolutely agree. And to Reverend Donte's point, I also want to highlight that the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy sees this as being a critical moral issue for the faith community and for people of goodwill like myself, might not admit to a particular religion, right? This is an issue that affects our communities. And so we are asking for clergy or leaders of faith communities to sign on to a letter asking the governor to issue this eviction moratorium, as well as fully fund the rent relief program that we have discussed on this program earlier. If you are a leader of a faith community or part of a faith community and you would like for your pastor or imam or leader of your temple to sign on to this letter, please do so. And you can connect with us directly if you missed this link. In closing, I really wanted to say thank you so much, Phil, Elaine, Reverend Donte, for your time and your expertise, and just tell you how much we appreciate you and all of the work that you're doing in this very critical moment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us and for the work y'all are doing.
Yes. Thank you, guys. And I love you all. Virtual hug.
Virtual hug, Reverend Donte. Thank you all so much, and be blessed. And we will be back with the same subject tonight, everyone. But for people who are Spanish speakers, you will be here with Phil Storey again, and also Edgar Arandayano from the Legal Aid Justice Center. So that's at 5 o'clock tonight, and we'll see you there. Thanks, everyone.